Alright, this will be video 2 for APUSH. Wartime also presented new opportunities for women. Although the number of women in the workforce did not increase greatly during the war, their means of employment did change. Many women quit domestic work and started working in factories. At one point, 20% of the factory floor manufacturing jobs were held by women. The symbol of the Rosy Riveter, however, belonged to World War II. These workplace advances ended with the war as veterans returned home and reclaimed their jobs. Southern blacks, realizing that wartime manufacturing was creating jobs in the North, undertook the Great Migration to big cities, like New York, Chicago, St. Louis, and Detroit. During the war, more than 500,000 blacks left the South in search of work. Many blacks joined the Army. W.E.B. Du Bois encouraged blacks to enlist, hoping that military service would provide an inroad to social equality. Sadly, the Army segregated blacks and assigned them mostly to menial labor. Fearful of the effects of integration, the Army assigned black combat units to French command. American participation in the war tipped the balance in the Allies' favor, and 2 years after America's entry, the Germans were ready to negotiate a peace treaty. Wilson wanted the treaty to be guided by his 14 points, his plan for world peace delivered to Congress in January of 1918, before the end of the war. 14 points call for free trade through lower tariffs and freedom of the seas, a reduction of arms supplies on all sides, and the promotion of self-determination both in Europe and overseas. In other words, in the end of colonialism. The plan also called for the creation of the League of Nations, a mechanism for international cooperation, much like today's United Nations. Wilson's 14 points served as a basis for initial negotiations, but the negotiations soon took a different direction. The European allies wanted a peace settlement that punished Germany, and ultimately they got it. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to cede German and colonial territories to the Allies, to disarm, to pay huge reparations, and to admit total fault for the war. Despite other nations' roles in starting it, most historians agree that by leaving Germany humiliated and in economic ruin, the Treaty of Versailles helped set the stage for World War II. Although much of Wilson's plan was discarded, the Treaty of Versailles did create the League of Nations. Wilson hoped that the League of Nations would ultimately remedy the peace settlement's many flaws, but when he returned home, a rude surprise awaited him. According to the Constitution, the President has the power to negotiate treaties with foreign nations, but those treaties are subject to Senate ratification. This illustrates the principles of separation of checks and balances and separation of powers. At the center of the conflict was the debate over the League of Nations, particularly Article 10 of the League's covenant, which many people believe curtailed America's ability to act independently in foreign affairs, specifically Congress's power to declare war. The Senate split into 3 groups: Democrats, who sided with Wilson and were willing to accept America's entrance in the League of Nations; a group of Republicans who were totally opposed to the League and were known as irreconcilables; and the Reservationist Republicans, a group of Republicans led by Henry Cabot Lodge, who was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and Wilson's political nemesis and intellectual rival. Much had been made of Wilson's stubbornness and inability to compromise, and in particular his refusal to accept what were known as the Lodge reservations. Ultimately, the Democrats and irreconcilables joined forces and defeated the treaty, which had been amended to include the changes suggested by Henry Cabot Lodge and reservationists. Thus, the United States was not a signatory of the Treaty of Versailles, nor did it ever join the League of Nations, an international organization envisioned by the American president to maintain world peace. Weary of the war, America was receding into a period of isolationism. The public wanted less interaction with Europe, not more, as the League would have required. Wilson tried to muster popular support for the treaty. However, while campaigning, Wilson suffered a major stroke, thereby ending whatever chance the treaty may have had of ratification. Many people wonder whether the League of Nations would have been more successful in preventing World War II had the United States been a member. So that ends all the World War I business. Now we're moving into the 20s and Jazz Age and moving towards that and the Great Depression. After World War I, the American economy went through a brief slump and then started to grow rapidly. By 1922, America was hitting new peaks of prosperity every day. The invention of practical electric motor were largely responsible for the economic boom. Like computers in the 1990s, electric motors became essential to work and home environments, driving industrial machines and household appliances. With the new prosperity, other industries arose to serve the growing middle class in search of trappings of affluence. Pro-business Republican administrations. As the age of the progressive reform ended, many Americans became more comfortable with the idea of large, successful businesses. Some of these businesses, such as department stores, offered both convenience and reasonable prices. Others, like the automobile industry, offered products that made life more convenient and conferred status on their owners. The government, which had worked closely with business leaders as a part of the war effort, also grew to be more pro-business during the era. Government regulatory agencies, such as the Federal Trade Commission, more often assisted business than regulated it. Labor unions fell further out of public favor, particularly when they struck against industries necessary to keep industrial America running smoothly in 1919, winter strikes that year. Unions striking for higher wages and safer working conditions in the steel, coal, and railroad industries were suppressed by federal troops. The Supreme Court overturned a minimum wage law for women and nullified child labor restrictions. All three of the era's presidents, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, pursued pro-business and policies and surrounded themselves with like-minded advisors. Like Grant, Harding had the misfortune of surrounding himself with corrupt advisors. Several of his cabinet members would wound up in prison. The most infamous incident of his administration was the Teapot Dome scandal, in which oil companies bribed the Secretary of the Interior in order to drill on public lands. Conservative on economic issues, Harding proved more liberal than his predecessor Wilson on issues of civil liberty. He supported anti-lynching laws and tried to help farmers, who were benefiting less from the new economy than were middle-class city dwellers, by providing more money for farm loans. Harding died in office, and Coolidge as vice president assumed the presidency. When Coolidge ran for president in 1924, he turned the election into a debate on the economy by running on the slogan, Coolidge Prosperity. Coolidge won easily and followed his mandate, continued Harding's conservative economic policies. He also pushed for lower income tax rates. We will discuss Hoover's presidency later when we discuss the causes of the Great Depression. So let's stop there. I got one paragraph, finished paragraph. Pro-business atmosphere of this era led to a temporary decline in the popularity of labor unions. Membership's levels dropped throughout the decade. Also contributing to the drop were the efforts of businesses to woo workers with pension plans. Opportunities for profit sharing, the company parties, and other events designed to foster a communal spirit at work. Businessmen hoped that if they offered some such benefits, they could dissuade workers from organizing and demanding even more. Such practices were often referred to as welfare capitalism. All right, let's look at the key concepts. I haven't covered any of the key concepts from Unit 7 yet. We're looking at Unit 6 still, 6.11, Reform in the Gilded Age. A number of artists, critics, including agrarians, utopian socialists, and advocates of the social gospel, champion alternative visions of the economy for U.S. society. Many women sought greater equality with men, often joining volunteer organizations, going to college, promoting social and political reform. 6.12, controversies over the role of government of the Gilded Age. Some argue that laissez-faire policies and competition promoted economic growth in the long run, and they opposed government intervention during the economic downturns. Foreign policymakers increasingly looked outside the U.S. borders in an effort to gain greater influence and control over the markets and natural resources in the Pacific Rim, Asia, and Latin America. There's some imperialism there. Politics we've covered in the Gilded Age, and we're looking now at Unit 7, 7.2, which will be imperialism. Imperialists cited economic opportunities, racial theories, competition with European empires, and perception in the 1890s that Western frontier was closed to argue that Americans were destined to expand their culture and institutions to people around the globe. Anti-imperialists cited principles of self-determination, invoked both racial theories and U.S. foreign policy tradition of isolationism to argue the United States should not extend its own territory overseas. 7.3, Spanish-American War. American victory in the Spanish-American War led to the U.S. acquisition of island territories in the Caribbean and Pacific and an increased involvement in Asia and the suppression of nationalist movement in the Philippines. 7.4 is the progressives. Some progressive-era journalists attacked what they saw as political corruption, social injustice, and economic inequality, while reformers, often from the middle and upper classes and including many women, worked to effect social changes in cities and among immigrant populations. The progressives were divided over many issues. Some progressives supported Southern segregation, while others ignored its presence. Some progressives advocated expanding popular participation in government, while others called for greater reliance on professional and technical experts to make government more efficient. Progressives also disagreed about immigration restriction. On the national level, progressives sought federal legislation that they believed would effectively regulate the economy, expand democracy, and generate moral reform. Progressive amendments to the Constitution dealt with issues such as prohibition and women's suffrage. Preservationists and conservationists both supported the establishment of national parks while advocating different government responses to overuse of natural resources. All right, 7.5 is World War I, which we'll cover that on the key concepts tomorrow, and wrap that up with the 20s.